Right, good evening, South Ribble. Welcome to in advance of the Cop26 Climate Summit, our kind of local South Ribble Climate Summit. I'm joined by three brilliant, wonderful speakers for panel one, and I'll introduce them shortly in a moment. And then we'll start to hear from some kind of fantastic local groups that are working to protect our wonderful environment, both here in South Ribble and more broadly. And we'll get to that about 6:05. But before we even start, what on earth is this COP thing? I've had some people coming in saying, what does it stand for? So it stands for the Conference of the Parties. And the parties are all of the people that sign up to the UN. So in my role as MP for South Ribble, I am part of the governing party, and I have been asked to be the PPS, the Parliamentary Private Secretary, to a chap called Alok Sharma, who has spent the last 18 months working incredibly hard to fulfil his role that he was appointed by the UN, which is COP President, so COP President Designate, and we're going to hear from him shortly. But the parties are all of the different 197 countries plus the EU coming together in Glasgow in about 4 weeks to discuss climate change and what we can do together to fix it, how to keep 1.5 alive, how to stop the Earth warming by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's still lots of work to do, but I thought before we heard from Alok, I'd give you 4 very brief areas of where the work's been focused. One, it's about encouraging countries to come forward with ambitious plans to reduce their climate change gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane. 2, it's about putting the money where your mouth is. Those richer countries that perhaps have contributed much more to emissions in the past, coming together to try and pledge to get to a target of $100 billion annually to help developing nations who are often more vulnerable to climate change and the effects of climate change. 3, adaptation and mitigation, where we help countries that are already seeing the effects of global warming adapt and change their communities, their ways of life to mitigate the changes of climate that's already happening, and the finance is going to help them do that. And 4, the least interesting, the least sexy, but arguably the most important part of it, which is completing the Paris Rulebook. So understanding what we need to do to make sure that we're comparing apples with pears when countries come forward and say, I have cut my emissions by this many bananas, and somebody else says, I have cut my emissions by this many oranges. We need to be able to talk together globally to make sure that we're measuring the effects of climate change. So, without further ado, why are we here today? That's a big long list of kind of very noble and huge things. And it's because actually the people of South Ribble and my wonderful panel are engaged and interested in making sure that we leave a planet that's habitable for our children and our grandchildren. It's arguably one of the greatest challenges we face at a global scale, but also at a local scale. So I'm really looking forward to an engaging debate. And maybe what we could do to kick that off is to hear from the man himself, hear from the man that will be in that blue zone in Glasgow in about 4 weeks' time with tens of thousands of people discussing those 4 things and how we save the planet. So I have a short video from COP President Designate, my boss, Alok Sharma. So hopefully the technology wizards behind the scenes will be able to show you a short video from Alok now.
Hello, I'm Alok Sharma, President Designate of Cop26. Cop26 is the critical United Nations climate change conference that we are holding in Glasgow in November, where almost 200 countries will come together for one of the most important climate conferences for years. And the reason it is so important is simple. Time is running out to address the impacts of climate change. In 2015, the world signed the Paris Agreement, an international deal to tackle the threat of climate change. And world leaders committed to do all they could to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and closer to 1.5 degrees because the science shows that this would avoid the very worst effects of climate change. But to keep that 1.5 limit within reach, we must halve global emissions by 2030. And that means taking action now. Now, the good news is that there is no choice to be made between protecting the planet and thriving economies. Here in the United Kingdom, for example, over the last 30 years, we have grown our economy by 78%, whilst cutting emissions by 44%. And across the country, we aim for the economy to support 2 million green jobs over the next 10 years. At COP26, we want to put the world on a path to driving down emissions until they reach net zero by the middle of the century. And that's essential to keeping the 1.5 degree limit alive. We also want to take action to protect people and nature from the effects of climate change, like storms and droughts, to get public and private finance flowing to climate action, and to work together to make the negotiations in Glasgow a success. We all have a role to play in tackling the climate crisis. It is the combined efforts of cities, regions, businesses, communities across the UK, and indeed across the world, that will make our clean, green future a reality. So I urge you to explore what your area, your community can do. And together, at COP26 and beyond, let's make 2021 the year we get the world on track to protect our precious planet. Thank you.
Fabulous, fabulous. It's a real privilege to be a tiny cog in that machine. I'm a glorified bag carrier. I don't want to be, I care about it very passionately. I have some background in it, but the work that he's doing with world leaders is pretty phenomenal. So, shall I introduce our panelists, who not only have proved themselves to be climate change experts, but are also experts in not looking at it and thinking, is this my technology or not? So, given Gareth won first prize in pointing out that everyone's all frantically typing, it might not be a brilliant plan. So Gareth is Gareth Redman King. So he's the COP26 Communications and Engagement Lead at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, which is a really key not-for-profit organisation that is supporting informed debate on energy and climate change and issues here in the UK. And, he's focused, I've spoken with Gareth previously, he's a very knowledgeable speaker, on the road to COP26 and what it means for us. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Gareth shortly. Second, sporting the nicest blue sweater I've seen for some time, is Tom Evans, who is the COP26 researcher on geopolitics, diplomacy and security at E3G, which is the independent European climate change think tank, climate diplomacy and what needs to bring the world together for COP26. So Tom, that sounds really interesting. I know we've not spoken before. It's not exactly a short brief, is it? So I'm going to look forward to hearing from you and your views on what you can share with South Ribble. And then last, but by certainly no means least, is Lancashire's very own finest, Councillor Sean Turner from Lancashire County Council, who is the newly created cabinet member for climate change and environment. I think it's am I right, Sean, saying that that's the first time this role has been created in Lancashire County Council? Are you the first incumbent?
Yeah, brand new in May this year. Brand new.
That's the sign of how things are changing. So we're going to look forward to hearing from Sean in terms of how Lancashire is going to be stepping forward to meet the climate challenges. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, the already introduced and inimitable Gareth Redman King. Gareth, what do you think about COP26 and what can you share with South Ribble today?
So thank you. I'm a bit worried that I'm the least useful speaker here now after what Katherine has introduced and what Alex Sharma has just said in terms of setting the context. But I will canter through what I think the road to COP looks like. The road to COP is pretty short now. This climate summit is taking place in Glasgow in less than 4 weeks' time. And at that point, world leaders are going to descend on Glasgow with a whole load of media and NGOs and experts and climate scientists and business people. And there's going to be an awful lot of people in one place trying to do these things that Katherine and Alok have just described. And Alok Sharma there set out why this is so important, what the Paris Agreement set in place 6 years ago. Obviously, COP would have taken place last November or December, last November, had it not been for COVID. So it would have been 5 years after Paris. And that's important because the Paris Agreement builds in points in its process where countries are required to step up and increase the ambition in their emissions pledges. And that's why COP26 is so important in the context of this effort to keep warming to well below 2 degrees, but aiming for the relatively much safer 1.5 degrees, which is what's set out in the Paris Agreement. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen emissions rise by over 1 degree centigrade. And, if we haven't noticed the impacts of that in recent years, which of course we have, just this summer would be one of the starkest illustrations of the impacts of that temperature rise in terms of fires and floods, unprecedented extremes of heat and devastating hurricanes, to name but a few things that have happened this summer alone. 2 degrees is extremely dangerous. And as we discovered recently, and why there is so much work still to do in the run-up to COP, on the basis of the promises that have been made so far by nations, actually we're a long way off that. We're on track for 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. And just to say, by the end of the century sounds quite a long way off. And for many of us, advancing in years, it is still, it can feel a long way off. But kids that are born today in this country and kids that have been born over the last decade are going to see this. They're going to see the devastation that 2.7 degrees would cause, which is why it's so important that the efforts to keep warming to 1.5. So just to expand slightly on some of the things that Katherine and Alok said there, ahead of COP, what we're looking for from nations is real plans for real deep rapid cuts in emissions and to protect nature. So it's things like ending reliance on coal, cleaning up our electricity, using wind and solar to generate power, tackling emissions from our agriculture and from waste. But I mentioned protecting nature as well, because natural systems absorb some of our emissions. They can help us to do this job. Trees, soil, peatlands, wetlands, they all store carbon, some of those emissions that we cause. The money that is needed to help poorer nations. Rich countries promised that by 2020, they'd be giving $100 billion a year in climate finance to help poorer nations to deal with their own emissions cuts. But as many of those countries are quite low emitters, much more importantly as well, to help them to adapt to climate impacts. That promise hasn't been delivered yet. There are some reports today that the calculation that the gap has narrowed to something like 10 billion, but that's still quite a long way off, just 3.5 weeks out. So some really positive movements at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago when the US committed to doubling its contribution, and that sort of thing from a rich, big emitter is really powerful in terms of leading other countries. And then there's also the real action that's needed to deliver these cuts, ending reliance on fossil fuels, stopping deforestation back to nature again, destroying huge natural systems like the Amazon rainforest to make way for livestock and food for livestock. That's removing those systems that not only store carbon, but actually help to regulate the planet's climate. So all of that is stuff that nations should be doing now before we get to COP, so that at COP, governments can then agree a deal to move much faster, which means reviewing those 2030 emissions more frequently and sooner, certainly in the run-up to another landmark that's built into the Paris Agreement, which is the 2023 global stocktake, and to provide long-term strategies as well for each party to provide long-term plans to show how they will get to net zero emissions by the middle of the century. A clear sense of how those rich governments will close the finance gap that I just mentioned, because once they've delivered on that 100 billion, then the next stage is to start negotiating how they deliver a higher level. Because 100 billion sounds a lot of money to us in a national context, but in the context of what we need to do globally to tackle the climate crisis, it's a relatively small sum. We need trillions, but the billions that come from governments and from international multilateral banks is really crucial for unlocking the private sector trillions. And actually, that's we've demonstrated some of that here in the UK with the way that we have funded, say, offshore wind, for example. But one of the other things that they really need to be able to do at COP when they come together is to show more real support for the loss and the damage which climate vulnerable countries simply can't afford, the loss and the damage that is caused by climate impacts. And none of this climate finance, or this support for loss and damage. None of this is charity. It's not just doing doing it for out of the good of our hearts. Wealthy countries have been burning fossil fuels for a very long time. It's helped to grow our wealth. We owe it now to people in the parts of the world vulnerable to things like rising sea levels and to devastation from hurricanes, to protect their lives and livelihoods from the effects of all that fossil fuel burning. They contribute very little to the problem, but the cost of the impacts falls very heavily on them. And then finally at COP, we need to see countries agreeing a move away from, as I mentioned, investment in fossil fuels, but things like committing to no new coal plants, moving to electric vehicles, investment in clean power and climate solutions instead. And all of these things that we've been talking about, they amount to a big old list. But in short, countries need to live up to the promises that they made in the Paris Agreement 6 years ago. All the polling here, all the polling around the world shows that people want and expect that. And straightforwardly, that means cutting our emissions, protecting and restoring nature so that nature can protect us, and wealthy countries helping people in poorer nations who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Gareth, that's a trot through a very, very complicated subject, which just shows the depth of your kind of knowledge and understanding in the detail, especially the loss and damage, adapt and mitigate, but what are we going to do to help people that are already feeling the effects of climate change? It's a really live topic, and maybe one we can come to later, but thank you, that's brilliant. What I'll do next, though, is hand over to Tom Evans from E3G. God, I can't speak today. Climate change think tank. It's a huge brief that you've got there, Tom. What would you say to the people of South Ribble in the run up to COP?
Sure. Thanks very much, Catherine. And yeah, even harder to go after you and Alok and Gareth. And Gareth's overview of COP was incredibly comprehensive. So I think I won't kind of repeat what he said in terms of the aims of COP and the context of COP, but it might be helpful to talk through, I think, how we deliver that and what goes on in terms of the UK's leadership of the COP. I think it's still important to emphasize kind of what Gareth said in terms of the fact that as we come into Glasgow, we're not on track to where we need to be in terms of our future emissions trajectories and what would be a level that's safe with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. But I think it's also important to emphasize that, we still have time to actually make sure we do get on track. And you'll have seen earlier this year in August, there was the major science report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that really led news headlines around the world. And it showed, two things. It showed firstly that the fact that, we can still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's still within reach and it's still feasible. And it's why it's so great to see that the UK's firmly made that one of the aims of COP, and we can still, keep climate safety in reach. But at the same time, it also showed us that the window for action is closing and that it's getting harder and harder to reach that goal and time's running out. And above all, I think it shows is that we need action now in the 2020s. And that really kind of cements the fact that we cannot wait any longer. We cannot wait for 2050 or beyond to get some of this action. We need it delivered today. And as Gareth mentioned, we have this Paris Agreement structure in which all countries will come up with stronger climate targets. But the fact of the matter is that Glasgow will need to be able to deliver that sooner. And I say all this because the discussion around 1.5 degrees and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees has very much become probably one of the biggest issues that countries talk about in meetings between world leaders, in meetings between climate ministers, and all of those meetings that Alok Sharma has been having throughout the past 2 years, flying around the world, sitting down with almost every country to talk about. The 1.5 issue is very challenging. I think the big challenge is, and to be very kind of simplistic about how we approach these big negotiations of 190 countries, but an easy way to think about it is that we have the UK here trying to be a referee and trying to bring all the countries around the table to agree to that one shared vision of how we take more aggressive climate action. On the one hand, we have the countries on the front line of the climate crisis. We call these the climate vulnerable countries. They are often small island states in the Pacific or in the Caribbean. They're developing countries in the global south, and they don't have huge resources to be able to tackle climate change but also they're largely not responsible for the overwhelming burden of global emissions because they're very small countries. And on the other hand, we have the big major economies, including the US and kind of Western economies, but also increasingly major emitters in the developing world, like China and Russia and India and Brazil and South Africa. And the challenge around trying to bring everyone together is that whilst everyone kind of wants to be able to do more on climate change, it's not necessarily in everyone's economic interests, which it should be seen as in everyone's economic interests to tackle climate change, but there are many countries who still want to hold on to the fossil fuel economies of the past. And I think the challenge is, how does the UK bring everyone with such diverse opinions to that same process? And I think in the final few weeks to COP, there's a couple spaces where we're starting to see the UK try and bring people together. The first one to flag was happening actually last month, at the end of last month, which was the UN General Assembly. And that was a space, again, where all the world meets in New York and we're talking about climate change. And I think it was really encouraging to see, Boris Johnson in his speech really focusing entirely on climate change. And he exactly kind of focused on the fact that we need to have much more diplomacy to keep global warming to under 1.5. But he also focused on the G20, and the G20, the group of the kind of 20 biggest economies, they'll be meeting at the end of this month. In fact, they're meeting the day before COP26 starts, and that's the World Leaders Summit of G20 economies in Italy. And that's going to be a key area where we're expecting some of those outcomes that Gareth talked about in terms of getting agreement on kicking out coal from our global economy and from G20 countries, ending finance to coal abroad. And ultimately, the big prize will be getting the G20 to agree on trying to increase efforts to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. And if we're able to unlock that, hopefully we can then kick off COP26 with the big global economies agreeing on the need to do that and bringing everyone around the table in November at COP in Glasgow. I think finally, I'll close by saying all of that diplomacy is very complicated. It's very, even someone who works on it like myself all the time finds it kind of overwhelming because there's so many actors and so many different people in meetings all the time. But I think it's really important to remember that, the UK has shown this leadership on COP26. It's amazing that they have taken on this presidency role. But the only reason that the UK can go around the world and try and persuade people to do more on climate change is because they've done so much already at home to start tackling climate change. And we are one of the world leaders, but we have to absolutely maintain that position if we're to have any authority on the world stage in the future. And this is, the Prime Minister said it's an area of great interest in terms of his foreign policy to make climate change one of the top priorities for foreign policy in the UK. But all of that depends on much more ambition at home and getting our emissions down quicker. It's great to see this week that the UK is committed to reaching clean energy, 100% clean electricity by 2035, and implementing that will be really challenging. But that's where I think it connects to kind of the local conversations that are taking place in constituencies across the country. And I think how do we deliver that at the local level is kind of really key to actually delivering what we want to do at the international level. And I'm sure Sean can talk about some of that as well in terms of how we tackle all of those issues to delivering net zero at the more granular level. But it definitely does connect. And I think I always try to remind myself that when you're kind of thinking about the UN and a very big, complicated thing, well, actually, it all begins at home. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Tom, that was amazing. I think it's that kind of the description of the complexity of it. To put it into context, when we take on the presidency and we invite the world literally to come to Glasgow, we're talking about asking Russia and China to agree with America. We're asking Saudi Arabia to agree with Iran. And you could go round different views and worlds and conflict zones, but actually we're asking people to set all of that aside and come together to kind of make a commitment for the planet. And I think it would be really interesting once we had the opportunity to hear from Sean to maybe pick up in the Q&A some of the ideas about how we actually translate that to net zero. Because of course COP is about bringing the world together to try and get a set of commitments that allow for action. But what that action is, as you started to touch on, is going to be really important. So brilliant. I look forward to your insights in a short while. But before we do that, I just want to fall to our final speaker, Councillor Sean Turner, the Cabinet Member for Climate Change and Environment. Sean, let's hear from that Lancashire perspective. Having heard from both Tom and Gareth and their expertise, it's a new role, it's exciting. How's Lancashire kind of starting to address this?
Well, thanks, Catherine. And as you said, I came into this role in May this year. And this is down at the Lancashire level, so this may be a little bit less sexy than what Tom and Gareth have just been talking about, but important all the same. We are a pixel in a much bigger picture, but an important pixel all the same. I think what I want to preface this with, to start with, is that this isn't Catherine's, Tom's, Gareth's, Alex Sharma's, or even Boris's issue. It's all of our issue. And the other thing I want to say is that we could all do better, and this isn't about finger wagging or pontificating, which is I've got to be really certain to say that I could certainly do better, because I've got no halo above my head. But that said, the Lancashire picture is as follows. So I came in, and one of the things I wanted to find out straight away is what we were doing as an authority. What setup did we have? Started digging down, because previously it was a different portfolio. I wasn't aware. I knew we were doing some greeny type things, but I didn't know exactly what. And what I found out was that we were doing some pretty good stuff. And for example, by February next year, we will have changed all of our street lights, 151,000 of them, to LEDs, which is a huge saving on CO2 and financially as well. We've just procured some more electric vehicles as the technology's got up to what we require. Then we're starting to do that. So there is stuff going on. We didn't have a separate team for this agenda. We've now recruited one, so it was bolted onto the end of people's jobs, other roles. So we've now got a dedicated sort of green team, if you like. So that's what we're doing internally. Getting the council to sign up to being a carbon literate organisation, which involves training the workforce and infecting the workforce, really, so that they understand what their impact is on things they do during the working day and beyond. And also, we're going to sign up to the race to net zero, and I'll come to that a bit later about when that will be. So pre-pandemic, I found out we also had this decarbonisation strategy group for Lancashire, which continued through the pandemic. Political input fell out of it, so the politicians that were on it from across Lancashire, all the districts and unitaries, they came off through the pandemic, but it continued, which was good. And as part of the building back better, and greener and faster, we've devised, our strategy is based around a Greater Lancashire plan. And there was 12 commissions in total about how we might do that, and 4 of those were environmental. And it's those that I want to quickly talk about today, and it will have to be very quick. They still are in draft form until the middle of this month. But basically, the first commission was a carbon pathways, so understanding our optimum pathway and how achievable it was. Climate resilience was another one, where we're vulnerable to extreme impacts, environmental impacts, so flooding and that sort of thing, and drought. State of the environment report, which was comparing us back. We fortunately had another state of the environment report in 1991, so that's been a nice comparator, so we're able to look back at that. And then renewables deployment across the county, about opportunities for more, and like I said about the street lighting, where were we woefully short, or were we doing okay, and comparing again against past sort of dates onto where we were. So this is intended to be that these 4 documents are what sort of give us the evidence to work forward and where we might make the biggest impacts into achieving net zero. And so to quickly move into those reports, a sneaky peek for you, because like I say, they're in draft form, but some of the figures from the first one, the carbon pathways. So we did have a finger in the air date of achieving net zero by 2030, which I think went through the council in 2020 at some point, but without this evidence that's now coming from these reports. So the first headline will be, if we used all the available interventions that we've got, from between now and 2030, we wouldn't achieve net zero by 2030. So that's saying the target's going to have to be more realistic, but still ambitious. So it would be possible to achieve 68% reduction by 2030 and 78% by 2035. So depending on which pathway we took. The first pathway, so 68% by 2030, that means we could reach net zero in 2046. And the cost of that would be £29 billion. If we took the latter one, that would be £25 billion, and we'd get there by 2048. So that's the sort of size of the issue. The second report, climate resilience. So climate change trends are already clear in Lancashire. Northwest England is 1.5 degrees higher in the 21st century compared with the end of the 19th century. We are experiencing 20% more rainfall right now, than we did between 1960 and 1990. So that's not that very long ago. And at Heysham, for example, recent rates of sea level rise are 4 millimetres, which is faster than the UK long-term average of between 0.2 and 1.4 millimetres, but consistent with the global rate of sea level rises since 1990. So they're things that are specific to Lancashire, and obviously many more extreme events are predicted. Report 3, which was around the state of the environment, 1991 to 2021, we're looking at that sort of period. Air quality pollutants generally fell, but still well short and only partially meets the plan or the strategy. Water quality, this is a bit of good news. Ecological status and chemical status of most Lancashire water bodies, which is over 90% of those bodies, have received good or high ecological status since 2009. There's been a lot of investment around that, from utilities companies too. But back in 1988, only 41% of rivers were rated good. So you can see that that's an improvement. It's not all bad news. Bathing water, back in 1990, all beaches failed the compliance tests. Now we're at 100% of compliance, and we have been since 2016. And nature sites, statutory protected and non-statutory protected sites have increased substantially since 1991. So there's some positives. Report 4, which was around renewables deployment. Installed renewable energy generation is growing rapidly year on year across the county, up 41% over the last 5 years. But despite that, it's woefully short of where it needs to be. And it only accounts for 13% of power and 8% of heat demand across the county. So much more radical approach is needed. To finish, 3 specific areas I wanted to mention with regard to South Ribble. A recent ONS report for projected green job creation has pinpointed South Ribble as being at the top of the pile, ahead of Leeds even, in terms of job creation in green jobs. I always think green jobs sounds a bit woolly. Some of these green jobs will be very skilled jobs, high-tech jobs, so not just, planting trees or whatever sort of things that evokes. But Farrington Waste Processing Plant, which is in Leyland on the Enterprise Industrial Park, we're looking at some investment there to solar the whole of the roof, which is a massive roof space, and its sister site at Thornton, and also bring back with some investment in some new plants around food recycling, food waste recycling, which I think we're going to have to do anyway, because I think the government are going to require that of us. And with those two combined processes, the food recycling being anaerobic digestion, we can generate enough power to run that site, which I think would be a real achievement, and actually supply some of the industry on the industrial park too. So that's another thing. And finally, on a more even more granular level, Leyland Library will imminently be receiving a retrofit around solar paneling and heat source pumps. So things are happening.
That's phenomenal. Leyland Library's going to go full heat source and air source or ground source. Do you know?
I don't yet. No.
No, but
it's very imminent.
But yeah, I know the government's put a series of grants out to help kind of local authorities start to kind of make improvements within their estate to help push it and also drive a market for the technology. I look forward to coming through with it in the Q&A. So, Gareth, Tom, Sean, that's brilliant, right? We've got some pre-submitted questions, but there is also the opportunity for people to ask questions as it comes up. We're going to have a chat for maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, just as a bit of a panel. So I'm actually going to change my view so I can view a gallery, so I can see all of you in slightly better detail. Now, in the pre-submitted questions, it's fair to say there's quite a few people that are really skeptical about this. Whilst we are all working in the field in some way, shape or form, there are people saying, is net zero by 2050 an aspiration or rather than an achievable target? You're looking at people that are their concerns are very much about land and preservation and house building, and that's the place to start. So when people have got those kind of skepticism and very granular concerns, given we've described the COP summit and the ambitions that are going to be set, what would you say to someone that is perhaps more skeptical of this agenda? I'll probably do it this first one. Gareth, if I start with you, and then I'll come to you, Tom, if that's all right.
I guess I'd mostly say two things. Firstly, that this might look daunting, this might look expensive, this might look complicated, but we've done an awful lot already. So we're on this path already. We're already doing a lot of this, but B, not doing this will be an awful lot more expensive and an awful lot more complicated, and it will do an awful lot more harm in the long run as well, because a lot of the additional expense that comes from not doing these things comes from the damage that is done by climate impacts. Some parts of the world see those climate impacts in a way, in terms of rising sea levels, which is genuinely existential if you're on a small island in the South Pacific. Here we are seeing it in the form of extreme weather, in the form of coastal erosion. Those things will get worse, and the impacts will be greater, and the costs of adapting to them will be greater, and the costs to people's lives and livelihoods will be much greater as well. And the second thing I would say is that there are huge benefits to doing this, both in terms of our individual, our individual lives, our health, our well-being, in terms of things like restoring nature, in terms of the switch away from petrol and diesel vehicles, so reducing air pollution, which does terrible harm, particularly to children and young people, but also on a sort of on a UK level, on a national level, in terms of the economic benefits. A study that was done a couple of years ago calculated that delivering on all of this to get us on track for net zero would give benefits, economic benefits, actual financial benefits to the Treasury, to the government of £90 billion a year, which outweighs what you have to pay out. And when you invest in these things, the returns come back threefold plus. And they come in terms of good quality jobs, and they come in terms of economic growth. So I would say that it's more expensive not to do it, and there are an awful lot of other good reasons to do it, as well as the impact on the climate.
It's very fair. Tom, do you think it's an achievable target, net zero by 2020, given that's our commitment to COP?
Yeah, absolutely. By 2050, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry. We should have done it 2 years ago.
Well, the sooner the better. But no, yeah, I mean, when the government committed that target, they commissioned their independent advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, to look into the feasibility of that. And that report clearly showed that it's absolutely economically feasible, and as Gareth said, huge economic benefits to doing so. But also that, the timescale, 30 years to transform the economy, was eminently achievable. And I think it's also, again, important to think about the international context of this, in terms of, if we don't move and try to seize investment early on in these low carbon markets of the future, in electric vehicles, in heat pumps, in wind turbines and solar energy, look at where China's investing, look at where America's investing, look at where Europe's investing. They're all heading in this direction. And if we've already got a great, lead, and we've been decarbonizing for quite a while, and we have a great position to capitalize on that. But if we don't, we will be left behind and behind in the race to net zero in the markets of the future, which are only going to grow and only going to be a source of further prosperity globally. So I think there's really, good kind of competition-based interests in trying to make sure that we lead from the front on this. And I think, yeah, exactly as Gareth said, it's all about opportunity and benefits and less about costs.
Yeah, I think you're slanging on something. I think it's difficult to convey in a format like this when you see the costs of inaction. If we go above 2 degrees, as Gareth said, the potential devastation not just to the planet but to the mitigation measures that we, never mind the rest of the world, would need to put in place. It's quite we're almost needing to invest in an insurance policy against that risk, which all the great and clever scientists believe is there. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to challenge it, because it's going to be has the potential to be such an enormous change. I was talking to school children today at Penwitham Girls' School, and they were asking the same questions. What happens if you can't afford an electric car? What happens if you want to keep your old fossil fuel car? And we often land on those tangible things. But the scale of the change that we need to take is not dissimilar to, when our ancestors came to the north of England, they came in from the rural environments on horse and cart, and, and their antecedents left, 30, 40 years later on steam trains. We are really going to do a big nodal shift like that. Sean, do you think Lancashire is going to be able to cope with net zero by 2050? It sounds like you've got some figures from your opening presentation that show a pathway. Could you perhaps highlight one that would allow people to think that it is an achievable target and not just an aspiration for us in Lancashire?
Yeah, well, I skimmed just a few relevant points out of that evidence base, and they're very thorough reports, and the facts and figures are there. It's clear we can achieve it. Obviously, it's going to take hard work. We can achieve it, but going back to your skeptical side of things there, we shouldn't see, and as Tom and both Tom and Gareth said, we shouldn't see this as a negative. There's lots of opportunity in there. I mean, I was at a meeting recently where somebody from the CBI was talking about the potential of a financial sector type industry for the UK from this. So it should be seen as an opportunity. It's sort of killing two birds with one stone. Going green is something that shouldn't be seen as negative. And I think sometimes when you see protesters blocking motorways, I think it has a negative effect. I admire the passion, but I don't think that's the good for the general public's perception on this whole area. It is an opportunity, as I said in my speech at the beginning. The South Ribble is at the top of the pile in the UK for projected growth in terms of jobs. So I think that's in itself really exciting. And then actually the rest of Lancashire is looking good for it too. It seems to be these old industrialised areas that spawned the Industrial Revolution are the areas now, the very areas that can take up the slack on the green agenda.
It's a great point. Well, in the interest of trying to, if you do have any questions in the audience, do pop them in the chat and we'll try and field them, or email in if you've got any difficulties. But in the interest of representing fairly the relatively extensive set of questions that we got in, thanks for those that pre-submitted, there's a lot of people kind of saying, okay, so what do I do? How do I start to contribute now? There are big levers that government needs to plan and pull. But what are some of the most important but achievable actions that I can take as a private citizen to address the climate emergency and affect policy? So is that a personal action in terms of climate emissions, or is that a personal action in terms of engaging the world in the run-up to COP to advocate for change? Tom, perhaps you could start with you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think from my perspective, in terms of what can you do to connect with COP26 and connect with world leaders, I think there's a few things that come to mind. I mean, firstly, definitely engage your MP. It's a good thing that, Katherine, you're so engaged. But engage, anyone in any position of power who has, influence and can make things happen in your local area, or can, you know, join a debate in the House of Commons and make sure that these are represented really vocally. I think, you know, there will be lots and lots of events going on across the country, I think, around COP, or if you can even make it to Glasgow, go and see what it's like and join in with, you know, I think there's a space called the Green Zone, which is part of the COP, but it's not the kind of official negotiating area. It's the part for wider civil society, for wider for the public from all over the world to join. Consider going and being part of that atmosphere, connecting with people and learning more about how we actually, you know, tackle this global challenge. And I'd also say that, you know, COP26 definitely isn't the kind of the end of it. And, you know, this is a really long journey, and it's not going to be kind of just solved at COP26. Like, that is definitely not going to, you know, be the case, because whatever's agreed there needs to actually be implemented. And I think it's about really seeing how you can consistently apply pressure and keep that pressure up on countries and leaders locally, nationally, to do more. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really exciting time, I think, November. I think there should be a buzz. Hopefully there's a buzz across the country like there was at the Olympics, and everyone will be talking about it. And I think just using that opportunity at COP to talk about, you know, what you've seen on the news. There's, you know, the BBC is going to be covering it. Every major outlet's going to be, it's going to be all over the papers and hopefully all over social media too. So I think sitting down with people and having those conversations and thinking through what you'd want to see in your local area and then making that happen, I think that's probably a good place to start. But there's also tons you can do in your own life, but I'll leave that perhaps to others to talk about.
Yeah, who wants to come in? Who wants to follow up with that? You know, what can private citizens do? Oh, Sean's waving his hand. Go on, Sean, and then I'll come to Gareth.
So dead quickly, don't fall into the trap, like I said at the beginning, of thinking somebody's got this covered and everything will be okay because, you know, they've got this sorted. I'm not going to pontificate, but maybe we could use our two legs a bit more sometimes, and that's just a thought. Certainly there's definitely things I could do better. I have gone electric with my car, but that was a personal choice. And, you know, obviously personal choice is just that. The other thing is really around getting involved with this area. As COP26 comes about now, it'll be all over the place. Get involved and listen, and you know, you'll learn a lot. I've learned a lot in the few months I've been here. And one of the other things is, my final point, there's support out there for businesses, for small businesses.
Yeah.
The Lancashire Chamber of Trade and Commerce, for example, I've just signed up with them, and they will come and look at you and audit your carbon footprint, if you like, free of charge, and that would normally cost you 1,250 quid. So go and seek out some of the support that's there. From there on, they'll come back with what you would need to do and how you might do it, and then there's more support available going forward from there into getting you into making some of those changes. So there's stuff out there, and I would say look at it now before a bigger stick comes down the line and the carrot's not quite as big as it was then, because we're going to have to go this way anyway.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think when lots of people in the debate assume that we're going to go immediately jump to stick, you know, we're going to ban it, we're going to make it illegal, we're going to make it very expensive. If I had £1 for every time in the last few days I've heard I prefer carrot to stick. You know, I think this is about, you know, engaging people at the pace they want to engage it. But Gareth, you know, what can a private citizen do?
Well, I would say carrot is good. That's a more plant-based diet, you know. But I think it's important to be clear that it's not, you know, like it's not all on us as individuals and it's not going to involve us all to make you know, sort of revolutionary changes in our day-to-day lives. There are lots of things that we can do less of, but there are lots of things that lots of us don't do any of, like flying, for example, where it's the responsibility of of governments and companies to regulate that better, to tax it differently, to incentivize things differently. And I think it comes down for how we can have impact. It comes down to me to two things: voices and choices. Voices, it's been mentioned a bit already, and of course, here in South Ribble, you don't need to engage your councillors and your MPs because they're clearly engaged, but you talk to other people as well, and maybe their councillors and their MPs are not as engaged. And the most powerful voice in anybody's life is their friends and family. So if you are doing things and you're engaged in these things, then talk to friends and family about it, because they have councillors and they have MPs as well. And on the whole, MPs don't hear from us enough about this stuff. And there are lots of things where they have to do things in Parliament and in Whitehall to make things cheaper and more accessible, to help bring down the cost of things like heat pumps, to help drive up the market for electric vehicles so that those prices come down. But there are very high impact things that we just don't think about in our day-to-day lives, about, for example, where our money is, what your bank is spending your money on, whether your bank is investing your savings or just, or anything else that you use your bank for, your mortgage, in fossil fuels around the world, whether your pension, if you have a pension, is invested in fossil fuels. There are ways that we spend our money and business, ways that we engage with businesses where our voices and our choices are incredibly powerful in helping move those businesses, and they of course have a much bigger impact than each of us individually has as a consumer.
It's a really great point. So there's a thing called Race to Zero, where one of my colleagues called Andrew Griffiths has been working with the FTSE 100 companies, encouraging them to sign up to be net zero by 2050. And it's not kind of sign a pledge on a wall. It's sign up and give quite a clear and, accessible plan of how you're going to achieve it. And oh, I've got somebody at the door. I've got two people at the door. But there's quite a lot of interest in that from them. I think well over 40% of the FTSE 100 companies have signed up to that with clear and specific and detailed plans. And what's actually happening is they're not only making an assessment of what they want to do to protect the environment, but they're making an assessment of their future, exactly as Gareth hinted about, based on consumer behaviour, based on where they think their kind of, their customer base is going on in the future, and also based on, some of the financial risks that inaction causes. So I think that's a really great point to make. I've had a series of different questions around single-use plastics, if I just move on to that. Now, what's quite interesting is the tie-in between the concern that has been imbibed, really, since David Attenborough did that Blue Planet documentary about plastics in oceans, but how sometimes that gets slightly conflated with climate action. So we have several questions about phasing out the use of single-use plastics in supermarkets, but there's a slight conflation of that with that having a significant effect on climate action. And so Tom, Gareth, you both referenced things that you can do in the background. I spoke to a bloke this week I was speaking on a panel who's invented a new kind of cable for electricity transmission that will reduce the resistance losses. And he gave an extraordinary statistic that 1.5% of the electricity generated in this country, full stop, no matter what green source, fossil fuel source, is lost due to the transmission losses. And he's trying to innovate there. And he believes he can save 1 gigaton of emissions just by losing less energy through the power lines. Now, obviously, there's a cost to it. So how would you scale single-use plastics and those smaller changes in consumer behaviour? Is that the point to attack on, or is that a point of personal choice, as Sean referenced? Gareth, I'll start with you, and then Sean, I'll come to you if that's all right.
So I think single-use plastics is an important point for lots of reasons, and I think let's not try and separate it ever from climate, because about 8% of the world's oil is involved in producing plastic, and as our plastic use grows, so demand for oil grows. Oil is a fossil fuel. Getting it out of the ground, processing it, burning it, is the thing that is causing the climate crisis. So particularly as some of the companies in the world most reliant on continuing to extract fossil fuels and find means of using them are looking for alternatives as we try and burn less of their product. Plastics may be an obvious alternative. So, it's not separate from the climate crisis, and it overlaps as well in terms of the devastating impact that it has on nature and wildlife. When you consider the kind of range of ways in which we are harming nature, including through the climate crisis, including through the warming and the various knock-on effects of that. And then the harm that we're doing to nature and wildlife by way of deforestation and removing habitat and encroaching on wildlife. And then we're chucking plastic in the seas and doing harm there as well. So these things are all interconnected, and this is something where we know we can have an impact on what companies do, whilst phasing out plastic straws from pubs is not going to save the world. It is a small contribution, and the fact is that now supermarkets are phasing out plastics. They're filling aisles with things that are packaged by other means. We need to avoid perverse incentives where we switch out something very light and cheap for something very heavy and that costs a lot of emissions to generate. So it's complicated, but single chuck away plastic use is a problem for lots of reasons, and where we can scale it back in our individual life and where we can use that to cause companies to do things differently, I think we should.
Yeah, that's true. Sean, it's interesting. There's aligned questions about how local government can kind of improve household and commercial waste collection and disposal. And I should imagine you deal with a lot of single-use plastics along with your colleagues. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, it's important to say, as Lancashire County Council, we are obviously the disposal end of that. We aren't the collection point because we're not like we're two-tier here. But yeah, it is a big problem. I mean, one issue, having visited the Farrington site, for example, is people who put rubbish in carrier bags. That inhibits our machine's ability to sort of, using the various sensors that it has, to separate that waste properly. So actually, plastic bags are a pain, and I think we've all done that: filled the plastic bag up and chucked it in the bin. So that's an issue, and yeah, if people can reduce the use of plastics, it would be definitely helpful. Like I say, the processing plant at Leyland and the one at Thornton does separate out the waste, but it can't do everything. It's not. That's
a really interesting insight. So given we're in the kind of what can individuals do, actually using single use or even multiple use plastics to recycle stuff is inhibiting recycling. And that's a really quick, low cost thing that we can all do immediately to help your teams kind of process more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if I don't know if people know where the waste goes. So the residual waste, 80% goes straight to be burnt for energy. It's waste to energy. It gets shredded. And if you ever visit that site, Catherine, I don't know if you've ever been, but it leaves you with a bit of a heavy heart, actually, because it's relentless. This is 24/7. And do people realise beyond their bin what happens to their waste? And just how relentless this stuff is. And when you see the wagons coming in, backing in, tipping more in, then another one tipping in, it's quite daunting to see what a throwaway society we've become. And anybody going there, it's really, really interesting. Yet it's daunting, as I say. So it's something I'm trying to reopen, because there's an education centre at that site. And I'm trying to get that to reopen on some scale, and we're looking at we can do that, so we can take.
You've painted just a really I think you've just really painted an interesting picture for us there about what it feels like to be on the back end of the behavioural change, the behavioural traits that we currently have. Tom, how would you kind of address single-use plastics? Do you think it's the little speck that starts the snowball rolling down the hill?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think hearing kind of the other panelists' reflections on it, for me, it sounds like, or it kind of feels like the single-use plastic debate has really exactly kind of opened people's eyes to how interconnected our our planet is to everything else. You know, you think about how the plastics are. They found microplastics in the Arctic Circle. They found microplastics in the most remote point in the Pacific Ocean. They are just everywhere, and you know, ultimately begins here. And I think it's about how you kind of, I think the single-use plastics debate and you know, progressively shifting to be more to move away from that kind of throwaway culture. I think it's definitely triggered a bit of a cultural change in how we understand you know, our consumption and how that impacts climate change, how that impacts environmental degradation. I think it's also shining a light on things like fashion and the fashion industry, and the fact that that also has, you know, huge environmental costs, and that's something that people can address by buying secondhand clothes, or by buying fewer clothes, or encouraging a repair society where we try and preserve what we have rather than necessarily creating a throwaway culture, as Sean described.
Charity shop, 50p.
Perfect.
Everyone always says to me, what is it? I'm like, I don't know, I've got to pay 50p for it in a charity shop. But you are absolutely spot on with that. Sorry, I interrupted your flow, but I think you're right. It's those little things, isn't it? You know, and a bit of practice what you preach. I think we're starting to draw to the end of actually what's been a really interesting discussion, kind of going from, you know, world leaders haggling about, you know, gigatons of carbon and hundreds of billions of dollars, right down to what we as individuals in South Ribble in Lancashire can start to do and joining up. If I'd maybe let everybody just have a final say, because I know politicians are famous on wanting it, but if I give a final say, and then we'll say thank you to this panel, and we'll step up to our second panel, which is, you know, very local speakers that are all working in the climate field. So shall I do it in reverse order? Sean, a very quick final word from you.
Yeah, sorry, just being disturbed at the time as you were calling me in then as well. Final word from me. I want to make a difference if I can. I'm really enjoying this role. It's been really eye-opening, I must admit. Always sort of, I'm a lover of the planet, a lover of the outdoors and biodiversity, nature. But having the more I learn around this area, the more it's spurring me on to say, right, okay, what can I do? How can I support others to make a difference? And you know, try and reverse some of this. I think the 1.5 degrees, keeping within that's really important.
Yeah, that's cool.
Some of the things that the scientists were saying just a decade ago are now happening. So when we're dealing with drought and flood in Lancashire and Cumbria at the same time, something's not right.
That's true. Tom, what's your final word to the good people of South Ribble?
Yeah, I'd say, you know, whatever happens at COP26, whether we get an amazing agreement or whether it's a very difficult and tense process, you know, the fight's not over. We have 30 years more to reach, you know, global net zero and actually tackle this crisis. So I think we can't ever give up, and the momentum just has to build and build and build. And I think, yeah, whatever the UK does on the international stage always comes back to its leadership at home. And I think applying that pressure and speaking to everyone from local to national level and trying to get that shift to a green economy going is absolutely key to actually delivering that at the global level too.
Thank you, Tom. And finally, Gareth, thank you so much for spotting that we weren't playing any audio. What's your final word on the topic?
On the audio note, I think I just finished by saying, I mean, the scale of what we are doing to the planet terrifies me and saddens me, and yet the scale of what we're able to do to fix it and to put it right and to stop it just awes me and sort of gladdens me in sort of equal measure. And I just like it more of the latter and less of the former. And I just would urge everybody who cares about this, who is interested in it, who wants to know more, to find out more, to seek out. There's so much information, so many people like me who are prepared to bore you rigid on it and answer any questions that you want to. Find out more about it, and then use your voices and your choices. Talk to friends and family about it, and talk to the businesses who you give your money to, and to the politicians who you give your vote to.
Gentlemen, what a cracking panel. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, really appreciate it. I think we'll just have a short pause now while we swap over and the technical gurus do their thing. So please do stay with us for the second panel coming up, where we start to hear from a really interesting, diverse range of people actually working practically on the ground in South Ribble to support our wonderful environment. Thanks again, gents.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, brilliant. So hopefully we're starting to get our panelists come on in. I can see we've got Alan there already.
Hi, Katherine.
Hiya, sir. So we're live. We're just pulling you all in. We've just had a really interesting discussion. John, Jack. Oh, brilliant! Oh, fabulous. It's a bit like meeting people in the pub, only with less alcohol. I think what we'll do is so let me just set the scene for you guys. I don't know whether you've had a chance to see any of our earlier discussion. We've really gone top down to kind of what we can do locally, but it's now my pleasure to, in panel 2, start to talk much more in detail about South Ribble and what's going on. So in no particular order from my piece of paper, I want to introduce Alan Wright from the Wildlife Trust at the fabulous Merestands Wood Nature Reserve. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the work that they do down there, and I'm going to extract a promise from you, Alan, not to laugh at my terrible bird watching that was occurring at Martin Mere on Sunday, because I confess I did actually have to look up what a black-tailed godwit was because I'm that out of practice. But you can point and laugh at me later. We've also got Diane Drinkwater from the Lancashire and Northwest Beekeepers. Now, at this point, I'm desperately trying to remember whether it's an apiarist or what's the actual technical?
An apiarist.
Right, okay, I don't know where that came from. That's probably the highest point that I'm going to make of this second panel, but really looking forward, the importance of bees and pollinators, and Diane will talk to us about that. We've also got John Lamb from Friends of the Earth in central Lancashire, who has the most impressive beard knot I think I've seen in the last decade, as well as a really very cool background. But he's going to talk to us about the work that's been going on from Friends of the Earth for over a very long time to get to the point where this is so mainstream, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing that. And then we've got Jack from the Spees from the Ribble Trust, which I would say you've got a nice beard, but I'm afraid you've been outdone by John. But you've got the river in the background, and obviously it's a huge part of where we are, south of the Ribble, as the constituency is named. And John's going to talk to us a little bit about that. And I'm also hoping that we get joined by Carol from the Preston Somopterists later on. So if you see another pet face pop up on the panel, then that's Carol, and we'll come to her. But this is really just about me giving you guys the opportunity to highlight the great work that you're doing. As anyone people's listening, if you've got questions, please do pop them in the chat. We've got a way of kind of moving questions around so that we can raise them later. But I'm going to let all of the panel give us, a quick 5 minutes of what they're up to, and then we'll come back to questions in hopefully kind of 40 minutes or so, if that's all right, panel. So shall I start?
We're just missing my partner in crime, Dave Dunlop. He's trying to get into the meeting.
Is he? Right. Okay. Well, the team are listening and monitoring. So, Alan, do you want to hang on for Dave to join before you do your presentation, or are you all right to start? Yeah. Okay. Fine.
He's here.
Oh, we've got him, have we?
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, double D. That's what we need. Right. In which case, Alan, Merestands Wood is wonderful. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been doing? Climate change, biodiversity, the wonderful woodlands and lakes that you've got there. South Ribble's own brilliant carbon store, I think is the way of putting it. Dave, welcome.
Merestands Wood is probably one of my favourite places in the world. Yeah, it's a fantastic place. But we'll probably just stretch things a tiny bit wider now. And I just want to go into the fact that we're talking about climate change. We're talking about a climate crisis, but this is also an environmental crisis that's affecting biodiversity. Consumers are worried about petrol in the cars and food on supermarket shelves, but this is a crisis for our animals and creatures. But it all ties in because, obviously, if global warming continues, many of the insects, plants and birds and mammals, which we all recognise from our childhood, and the kind of things we see at Merestands Wood and other fantastic nature reserves, won't be around for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And also, a third of the food we depend on is pollinated by insects, and many medicines rely on plants as well. So it kind of all ties in with everything we're doing. But we do get to see places like Merestands Wood, which are great carbon stores, because of the woodland and the water, but also within South Ribble we do have peatlands which are just really, really important areas, and we are one of the leading organisations in the country when it comes to peatland restoration for carbon capture and storage. Basically, the peatlands are our rainforests because they are actually better for storing carbon than the forests. So it's a really, we have got these really important areas across the county, certainly down on the Lancashire plains. We have been protecting and restoring peatlands in the northwest, and restoring plants and insects that haven't actually lived there for 150 years. So we're actually bringing those things back. So, you know, the Wildlife Trust is actually trying to work on that. Mearsands Wood's a great example of that, because again, you can actually get down there and you can see how we're working alongside the agricultural community. There are no enemies in this. Everybody's working together. We want everybody to work together, and we do want to work with the agricultural community. In so much as we are kind of coming up with a plan which is well on the way at the moment for a carbon farm, where if the farming community actually got involved in the carbon farm and carbon farming, they'd actually be able to make money out of carbon offsetting, which would hopefully help them with some of the problems they're experiencing. The NFU turned up and had a look at the carbon farm, which is at Winmarley Moss in Garstang, and they were very impressed by what we were doing down there. But I think the main thing for me is getting people involved, and Mearsands Wood is a fantastic place to get people involved, to actually get people to understand what wildlife's all about. I don't know if I've still got this memory of the first couple of months of lockdown when a lot of people were telling me that the birds were singing louder and the air was cleaner, and the air felt cleaner because there were fewer cars, there were fewer aeroplanes, and I actually think it was the wildlife reacting to that silence, to that calm that we created. So what are we going to do about it? We could use our cars a lot less. We could fly a lot less. There are a lot of things we could do. We could recycle more. And it's really time now that we actually looked at doing something. As Gareth was saying in the previous panel, we can't be doing nothing about this. We need to be doing something. You know, we've kind of got ourselves into this mess. So if we want to take action to save our planet, we've got to start in South Ribble. You know, we've got to start in our own gardens and actually start from there.
Alan, that's great. The idea of carbon for brilliant. And we've got Karen joining us. That's absolutely fantastic. The idea of carbon farming. So I popped up to RSPB Geltside, which is between Carlisle and Newcastle on the A69, and there it's an RSPB owned site that's also a hill farm with very similar to us, you know, really rich peat reserves, and they're talking about switching from farming sheep to farming carbon and water. And actually with a much lower density grazing stock, and actually it being a more profitable farming model, and you know, but some of the challenges that come to that. So maybe we can pick that up in the Q&A if you want. Yeah. Dave, did you want to add anything for the Mearsands Wood community?
A bit. I was going to talk a bit more about South Ribble constituency in particular. Well, I should give the National Farmers Union a plug because they're committed to net zero by 2040. What the main issues that are probably affecting biodiversity and the climate crisis in South Ribble are peat and salt marsh and their relationship to carbon storage and capture, sea level rise and agricultural production. As sea level starts to rise, society is going to have to decide whether it's going to continue to invest in ever higher barriers to keep the Ribble estuary off its natural intertidal area, to keep food production up, or to return that land to the estuary as a managed retreat, maybe through the new public payments for public environment and good approach that's coming in now that we've left the kind of agricultural policy. And of course, salt marsh itself offers a natural coastal flood defence, and it's great at capturing and storing carbon from the atmosphere. Similarly, as changing global climate and local weather patterns develop, we'll need to adopt our local farming practices and our local approaches to nature conservation. For instance, the huge flocks of pink-footed geese and whooper swans that currently come from their breeding grounds in the Arctic every year to overwinter in South Ribble constituency will find their breeding grounds in the Arctic thawing out and becoming more vegetated. And it'll be in doubt perhaps if they'll even start to make the ever longer journeys south to Lancashire, but will stay further north. Similarly, Lancashire Plains peat soils, they're very productive, but the exposed peat is on schedule to have almost completely oxidized into the atmosphere by 2050. So will we need to adapt to wetter farming practices like we're pioneering up in Woodmarley near Lancaster to slow down that release and keep that soil? And will there be new farming for carbon incentivized by public and private sector and through new financial sectors, like you mentioned, trading in carbon and biodiversity? Something that I gather is already being investigated by the new owners of the Croston Hall estate. Then there's the question of single farm payment for farmers and indeed for the Wildlife Trust on its nature reserves. How that will change in terms of payment for the retention of peat soils, nature recovery and landscape recovery schemes, though they're not due to be available until 23 or 24. Hopefully some of that will start to become clear when the Environment Bill becomes enacted later this month. The future is very uncertain, but with uncertainty comes opportunity. Very well put, David. Very well put. There's maybe something we can pick up in the Q&A. Thank you. That's really helpful. I've pressed the wrong button. I'm keen to let everybody have a quick view, and then we can get into it. So I'm going to move swiftly to Diane from the Lancashire and North West Beekeepers Association. Diane, over to you. Talk to us about those bees, those wonderful worker bees.
Yeah, hello. I'm here from, as you've said, Lancashire and North West Beekeepers, and we've got branches. We've got 8 branches that are all over Lancashire and the North West, going up as far as Lancaster, and then probably down as far south as Oldham. And we look after honeybees, and they are real barometers of climate. They're absolutely essential for a nice diet. We can live without bees pollinating food, but it'll be really bland and very, very boring. I think someone said a third of food's pollinated by bees. I think it's actually higher than that. And the issue we have is the weather changes, and whilst they're not necessarily climate change really yet, those changes to the weather patterns really affect the bees. And so what we need to do is make sure there's always food for the bees, which is in the form of flowers, and that can be garden flowers, bulbs, shrubs and plants, and bigger plants like trees. What it's always nice to do is be able to say your bees have access to pollen all year round. And simple things that people can do are planting bulbs, things like snowdrops and crocuses in the spring are really pretty for people. And quite often when they appear in January, it sort of lifts the mood a little, and winter's nearly over. Apart from a couple of years ago when I think it went on till about April. But the other effect of climate is the changes that happen. The bees, if they build up because they're expecting a normal spring, and the colony expands and expands, and then suddenly June and July are absolute washouts, which we've had in the past. Or conversely, it can be too dry, and when it's too dry, you have an equivalent problem of there not being any nectar made. The plants that make nectar need water to do it, and if there's no water in the soil, then they don't make nectar. And in the same way as if there's a lot of rain, all that nectar gets diluted and washed away. So, and if it's too wet and cold, the bees just don't fly. They're great to have in your garden, and if they fly below 8 degrees, you're lucky. You've got quite tough bees. So normally 8 degrees, they'll start flying. The season is going to change, and I know it changes across our region because I speak to all the 800 members at various things we go to, or as many of them as I can, and they'll say, I've not had much honey this year. And whilst it's not a real measure of how well they've done, it's a measure of how successful they've managed to be. We don't all take all the honey off them, but when they don't make any honey, it is actually a bit of a crisis for them, because then we have to feed them sugar. Sugar in this country is made from sugar beet, which we had the big debate about neonicotinoids being derogated for their use again, and we're quite concerned about that because it affects the bees through the pollen of the flowers it goes on. So there's so many things that are interlinked, but it is so important to plant things for the bees because, you know, we want the bees and all the other pollinating insects to continue. And whilst planting a few bulbs is nice, trees are absolutely brilliant. And I really don't understand why we don't plant more fruit trees, because fruit trees then have the added benefit of they feed the bees in spring, and at the end of summer they will actually feed the population. And we grow about 14 or 15% of the fruit we eat in this country, which is a tiny percentage. And these huge tree planting programs as part of this environmental progression, I really feel we do actually need to say, let's have some orchards, let's have orchards running across the country. And that fruit will be there to feed the hungry people that we keep hearing about. And it will feed the bees, which has got to be a really positive thing, because they'll help us make other food and get good crops on all the other plants we eat.
Dan, that's brilliant. And it's interesting. Alan actually popped a question in the chat saying, "What can we do to encourage more wildlife?" And thing. And you basically answered all of his question already. You know, it's that year-round planting. I agree with you on the neonicotinoids. The derogation's only for seed treatment. You know, it's not for spray application.
But it does come out in the flowers. That's the problem.
No, I understand that, but I think it's an important distinction because I did have some concerns around it and kind of dived right into it to make sure that we weren't allowed to going back to spraying again. But you know, you're right to highlight it. You know, these questions and trade-offs that we have to make as we move forward. But I'm going to pause there and then we can pick that up in the chat. So we now got John from Friends of the Earth. John, it's fair to say you've been at this for quite some time. So give us a couple of minutes about what Friends of the Earth's doing in central Lancashire and South Ribble, you know, for our audience.
Well, Central Lancashire Friends of the Earth covers Preston and South Ribble. We used to cover the Fylde and Chorley, but we've decided to focus down. We're one of 350 local Friends of the Earth groups in the UK. And we've been going since the 1970s, so we're getting up to our 50th anniversary. I've not been involved in Central Lancashire for 50 years, but it's certainly over 20 years. And we've been campaigning for sustainability in Preston and South Ribble since that time on a whole range of issues. I'll just run through some of them just to follow on from what Alan said with the biodiversity. You know, it's not just us that's facing the impacts of climate change, it's all the other species as well. So it's important to conserve the sites, the habitats and species in South Ribble and everywhere. We've had some tree planting sessions, which included a session at Bamber Bridge, part of South Ribble Borough Council's intention to plant a tree for every resident of the borough. So I've already planted mine, and that did include fruit trees, to please Diane. There's promoting cycling and walking routes. You know, we've got a good Sustrans network, and we were supporting that when it came through. We promote food growing, particularly on allotments, or using organic and permaculture principles. We're involved in the kind of gardening projects in Leyland and Penwitham in the past. We promote peat-free compost and peat-free gardening, promote public transport, promote recycling and renewable energy. But then we've been, on the other hand, campaigning against unsustainable subjects, such as the destruction of wildlife sites, habitats and species, against fossil fuel extraction, especially unconventional hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking. We campaign against incineration because it's burning things that shouldn't be in there, including food, and it also pollutes the air. And an important point to make is that whilst you can separate the air, the land and the water, both fresh and sea, everything is interrelated in some way, and everything has an impact on everything else in some way. So we can't just look at it in isolation. We have to be holistic, and that includes the fact that we are part of nature, not a part from it. And then there's litter, and there's pollution, pesticides, neonicotinoids, single-use plastics, especially carrier bags. Carrier bags does go back to the 1970s. That's a 50-year-old campaign in Friends of the Earth. And then there's unsustainable development. So we comment on plan applications and local plan policies. So we do this in a number of ways, which includes having stalls at farmers markets, Penworth and Gawler, on the shop on Fishergate Lush outside and on Preston Flag Market. We issue press releases. We network with other Friends of the Earth groups, especially in Northwest England, but also at national conferences. And we support Climate Action Preston, which is a Friends of the Earth initiative nationally. We also network with lots of other organisations, Fair Trade, Global Justice, Greenpeace, the Wildlife Trust, Marine Conservation Society, Preston Civic Society, and Transition Towns, which South Ribble used to have one. We'll organise film events and film screenings, well, we did in the past, but we also do nature walks. So we've had walks around Brockholes, around Longridge and Morton Mere. And then we do site visits to other places to see what they're doing. So we've been down to the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. We've been to Paul's Farm, which is on the edge of Leyland, and we've been to Incredible Edible Todmorden. And we also have social events and have some fun along the way. But specific to South Ribble, in 2011, we produced the Green Guide to South Ribble. It's out of date now, but maybe that could be updated and republished. But we also were involved in Ribble Strides, which is 15 self-guided nature trails around the borough of South Ribble that connect all the wildlife sites together. So the guide points out some of the flora and fauna you can see along the way. And it's important that people understand the nature. And I think the lockdown with the birds singing louder, although people hear them, probably hearing them because it was a lot quieter, you know, it showed how important nature is, how important the local green spaces are, and how, you know, we need to reconnect with nature because we are a part of it.
I'm actually just writing down, get those details so that we can share them out with the people that have signed up for the pod. So John, make sure you pass that through and I'll share it back out again. Yeah, cleaner, healthier, safer environments. I mean, that's what we want for all of us in it. Thank you, that's cracking. I'm looking forward to going it too. And you mentioned the Ribble walks, and there's a lovely segue to come to Jack from the Ribble Trust. Jack, you know, like all things are interconnected, it's not just about the river, is it?
No, absolutely, it's not. And I think it would be important for me to just give a bit of background. We're quite a lesser known charity, although we cover a big area. So we're very grassroots, and we use evidence and data to really target and deliver the most benefit we can for people and environment. And obviously we're focused on rivers, it's in our name. But those rivers don't just include the Ribble, they include all of the largest tributaries and all the small tributaries that feed those, such as the Hodder, Calder, the Darwen, which falls inside Ribble, and much more recently, the Douglas. I think it's also important to say our work extends far beyond the riverbank, and that's because, as you just said, everything's interconnected, and particularly through water. All of the water in our rivers has flowed across the land in which we live, work and play. And it picks up loads of problems and issues along the way. And we try and focus on where those problems start rather than try and treat it at the end when it's already in the river. We work from right in the heart of the Yorkshire Dales, ahead of Ribble Head, and all the way out to the shores of the Fylde Coast and everywhere in between. What do we sort of practically do? Well, we deliver a huge range of work, and we've been steadily increasing that in nature over the last decade. But much more recently, we've been accelerating it at an unprecedented rate, really because of the impacts of climate change and what impact that's having on rivers. Our own monitoring has shown declines in key indicator species. One stat is over a 1,000 metre length of stream, we saw a 9-degree temperature increase of the water, and that's just enormous. And obviously, we're seeing huge increases in the size and frequency of flooding. We've had new record river levels regularly over the last 6 years, and that's impacting people horrendously. But we're also seeing fish populations, invertebrate populations, and all the animals that depend on them suffering as a result. So partly in response to that, in 2020, we launched our Lancashire Woodland Connect campaign, which at its heart says we're going to try and plant 500,000 trees over the next decade. And that again, it has a 50,000 target. At the rate that we're accelerating our work, this winter we expect to plant 140,000 trees at over 100 sites and 40 schools. We're hoping to plant 1,000 fruit trees, and we were going to plant more, but there are very, very few available. So perhaps people are listening to people like Diane and planting more fruit trees. Within South Ribble, though, we're planting a site with about 8,000 trees, which is going to enhance biodiversity, support improved water quality, and reduce downstream flood risk, as well as improving air quality, but also, importantly, lock up carbon. And through that sort of carbon sequestration process, we're offering local businesses opportunities to offset locally rather than overseas in places that they can go see, enjoy and benefit from. But we also provide farm advice, educational activities, wetland work, peat restoration we've already heard about, control of invasive non-native species, and improvement to the environment through improved access and education. Quickly going back to South Ribble, really recently we opened up this fish pass in the background here, and this is on the River Darwen at its tidal limit at Holland Wood, and that means that salmon, sea trout and other migratory species can access the Darwen for the first time in decades, if not a century. Other important things, tackling giant hogweed, that's the invasive species that if you get the sap on you, it causes you burns, and they can last years or even a lifetime. We've been providing advice to farmers and grant funding to reduce the amount of fecal water getting into our river, which affects the wild coast and the bathing waters, which are so crucial to our tourist economy. And we've been working with the EA on their flood defence scheme that includes Walton Dale, providing some of the mitigation for some of the impacts of their work, but trying to make that mitigation deliver further reductions in flood risk. And we've delivered education programs in over a dozen schools in South Ribble, increasing the knowledge and understanding of hundreds of children. But importantly, we work together. We work with the Wildlife Trust, we work with the RSPB, the Woodland Trust, anyone who will work with us. And what do we see the future in its simplest form? More of the same. We've just got to keep upping our game and delivering more. And we've got to do this for people and the environment. We're all suffering. And we've got to tackle both the causes of climate change and the impacts climate change are having. And my last few points were, what can people do? They can support and donate to any of the environmental charities. We're all doing fantastic work, but actually key things are sign up, volunteer, get involved, help us. If you know people who are landowners or river owners and need help delivering improvements, put them in touch. And finally, I think I'm sure most people are trying to do something to improve, reduce their carbon footprint, but really push yourself and find one more little thing, even if it's the tiniest thing to reduce your carbon footprint, because in combination, all of our small actions will make a big difference. Thank you.
Jack, that's cracking. Thank you. I think I'm tempted to say exactly the same as I said to John, which is please make sure we've got those details so that we can share it out. I'm with you. I planted I've planted a fruit tree almost by accident, in fact. But you want to start to offset it. But the idea of businesses being able to offset their carbon load within South Ribble parliamentary constituency, or the West Lancs bits, or the Chorley bits, or the South Ribble Borough Council bits, if we work together as a collective, there's something really exciting there. So make sure we've got those. A final reminder our reminder, not a final reminder, to anyone that wants to ask a question. I can see questions coming through. They're being passed to me by the technical wizards. Please do pop it in the chat and we'll ask the panel what they think. But before then, with last but not least, in any way, shape or form, we've got Karen from the Preston Zoopterists International. Now you do all sorts of different stuff to help make our environment better, cleaner, safer, healthier. So Karen, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing in South Ribble and beyond? Karen, oh no, there you go.
I'm here. I was just unmuting myself. I've got a bandwidth low if I disappear. I don't know if I'm breaking up or anything. Am I okay? Can you hear me? You
sound perfect to me for now. Okay, yeah, go for it.
Fine. Yes, thank you, Catherine. I'm Karen and I'm from Zoopterist International with Preston. And we are the largest women's organisation in the world. We have over 72,000 members in 121 countries. And it's actually our centenary this year. And worldwide, we have pledged to plant 100,000 trees. which is quite good. And up to date, I think the last time they counted, it was 66,964. And we at Preston planted one, but one is better than none. That was at St Catherine's. What do? We do all sorts. We raise awareness of issues that people don't want to talk about. We do practical service projects. We've done litter picking, and we've, as I say, we've planted the tree. And we do like to collect things because it's nice and easy. And really, that's why I wanted to talk today, because I want to really talk about a response that I had to something that we started to collect. And it's these little devils. I don't know if you can see, plastic blister packs, the empty ones. We heard about an initiative that was going on, and we were told that if we took them to Superdrug, they would be recycled and the money would go on to raise to be donated to Marie Curie. So we were on it like a carb on it, because it's nice and easy, and also it's helping the recycling, which, while isn't going to change the world or help that degree very much, they're not going to go to landfill. So we were absolutely thrilled about this. And at that time, as one of the admins for our Facebook page, our social media page, at the time we had maybe 100 followers, and 90 of those were probably Sir Optimists, and 5 of those were probably from our club anyway. So we didn't have many shares, we didn't have many likes, hardly any comments with whatever we put on. But that's the way it was with our club. Anyway, so I posted a picture. It was a Thursday tea time. I posted a picture of a pile of these little devils that we were off to take to Superdrug that day. Just a few lines saying how we'd done it. We were collecting them for Superdrug and Marie Curie, blah, blah. And I thought nothing more of it. I just left it. And that evening, I just looked at my phone because I had something to do. And I noticed there was a direct message. Well, I've never had a direct message to do with Sir Optimist before. So I looked at it, and it was from a family in Chorley, and they wanted to support it. And I thought, fantastic, that'll do for me. I'll contact them tomorrow. It's bedtime, I'm off now. Next morning I looked. Oh, when I looked at it, I saw there were 256 people had seen it. So many people. I don't understand what the people seen means. I mean, how do they know? They've not moved their phone around. But anyway, 200.
Well, better stick to solving the environment today, Karen. We'll have to solve social media on the next kind of summit that we have.
No, I can't. It just over the head. So the next morning I look, and I think I'll just reply to this family in Chorley, and there are 6 direct messages. So my birthdays all come at once, and we've got 1,500 people reached. Well, I thought this was wonderful. And I'm going out, so I think I'll do it later. I don't procrastinate on everything. It was just the 6 messages was overwhelming. Lunchtime I looked, and there were 10,000 people been reached. And at tea time I looked, and there were 75,000 people had been reached. To cut a very, very long story short, by the peak of this, which was the Tuesday, so 3-4 days after I posted it, we had 4.5 thousand likes. We had 2.6 thousand comments, 107,000 shares, over 2,000 direct messages. My phone was just, I can't begin to tell you. And we had 8,658,000 people, 434 people reached. And from 100 followers, we've got 10,335. Viral, gone mad. At this point, I'm in the shed with a blanket over my head and a bottle of gin, because I think it's my job to sort it all out. The comments were messages that were basically all saying the same thing. Is there a collection point in Milton Keynes? Is there a collection point in Portadown or Jersey or Northern Ireland or Northampton? I didn't know. Can I post them? Where can I post them to? Will you come and collect them? And now I do believe at this point, as I say, that it's my job to sort it all out. So I contacted Superdrug, and you can Instagram Superdrug, you can Facebook them, you can Snapchat them, you can email them. You can even write them a letter and put a stamp on, like in the old-fashioned days, but you cannot ring them. And I couldn't actually form the words blister pack after all this. So I didn't want to do anything. I contacted Marie Curie, I have to say, weren't particularly interested, but I was working on the premise that if...
Karen, Karen, I absolutely adore the you in a gin with your bottle of gin under a blanket in the shared analogy. But go on, because I'm dead keen to get to the Q&A. But so go on, keep going. But you get where did you manage to get to Superdrug in the end?
We never got. Well, I couldn't cope anymore, so I didn't. We were still taking our little bags in, but 8 million people wanted to know about this. So I was working on the premise that even if only 200,000 people want to go in to Superdrug, that aren't going to go in because they don't know anything about it, Superdrug are missing out big time. You know, they might be selling a mascara or bubble bath, or in my case, Valium. And Marie Curie were missing out on an awful lot of money. Nobody seemed particularly bothered. I mean, Marie Curie said to me, "Oh, we're doing it on Snapchat." And I said, I don't want to appear too rude here, but it's like people of my age that are on a lot. Amazingly, I am a pensioner. I know it's hard to believe, but I am. So it's
no. Go on. Where did you get to, Karen? Where did you get to? Did you have success in the end?
No, absolutely not. We didn't. And so these little devils, nobody will. There's 197 participating locations that Superdrug will take it. I'm still getting emails. I'm still getting messages. What can we do? There is a need out there. I don't know if Sean's still listening. If Sean can kick some bums at South Ribble. I've contacted South Ribble. Will we take these separately? No, put them in the landfill. Put them in the landfill. I know it's not going to change the world, but it will make a difference. I'm sure if all these blister packs from all these people I was hearing from individuals, groups like us, medical centres, nursing homes. I even had an online drug company contact me and he said, we've got millions of these things and what can we do with them? Well, unfortunately, they're going to landfill and something needs to happen. But, I want to go back to the shed.
You're quite right, Karen. You're quite right, and it's solving these problems. I might politely suggest that you write to your local MP, so she'll go and ask questions in Parliament, for example.
I was kind of hoping.
No. Very happy to do so. And if anyone's listening from slightly outside, more of us the merrier on that one. Karen, that's brilliant. And what a viral success! And doesn't it just show the interest and engagement people have got? They do want to do the little things, and it's important. And as policymakers, we've got to get to it. Now, we've got about 15 minutes for a bit of a Q&A. What I'm not going to do is do it where everybody's got an opportunity to speak to every question, because it can get a little awkward. But if everyone just gives us a wave or jib in, it's not a huge group. I'm just going to throw a couple of questions out there and maybe, point to start from various people. So we've had someone coming in talking about carbon farming and peat areas, Alan and David. What they want to understand is are the mosses that we're so fond of in South Ribble, are they peat? And what's happening to them and what can we do to protect them? Because there's a worry that they're getting developed over and they're important carbon sinks. Alan, over to you.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, all these peat bogs that we've got. I mean, basically, the whole of the area between Manchester and Liverpool and upwards of there used to be a huge peat bog anyway. It has been developed. So yeah, I mean, we are kind of battling to buy as many parts of those areas as possible, because the more we get, the more important they'll be. I mean, the thing is, if we actually use the peat bogs we already own, Lancashire Wildlife Trust already owns, for carbon offsetting, the amount of companies that are now coming in to ask to actually offset against some of the pollution and the polluting they've been doing, we won't have enough. So we do need more areas. We need to be able to buy more areas, but obviously we need to get farmers involved as well to create these areas themselves by getting involved in this carbon farm scheme.
Yeah, I think it's worth just kind of pausing and checking back through. So what we've always colloquially called a moss in the northwest of England is actually just the top end of a massive peat bog, which is one enormous carbon store. I think
it's the top end of what's left of the peat, because if you stand on certain peat bogs in Lancashire and actually look at these huge landscapes, the peat was literally 10, 15 feet above your head before peat extraction started, and we started using it in our gardens and used it for heating as well. So another thing is we can all do our own bit by stop using peat.
There's only one little bit of intact raised bog or moss left in South Ribble constituency. That's in Much Hool, but it kind of stands up amongst all the farmland.
It's a really interesting point, David. Maybe you and I should go down and we can get some pictures out and show people what the difference is. Yeah.
The farmer's consent.
Well, very true. But I think it is important to have a visual picture when you're working to understand stuff. Yeah, and it's another interesting point that you make in terms of, you know, we've got a consultation as part of government to stop the domestic use of peat in gardens to prevent peat extraction. You know, it's one of the things that is really important as the heat sink. Anybody else want to jump in on the mosses and the peats and their restoration? John, brilliant, go for it.
Yeah.
No, John, you had it and then you pressed the button again. It's that double trigger finger. I suffer from it.
Oh, right, sorry about that. Yeah, I double clicked it. Just to make the important point that whilst the mosses are very important for growing food, every time that soil is cultivated, the peat is actually decomposing and emitting carbon. And it's only a matter of time, possibly 20, 30 years, all the peat will have gone. And it will be down to the glacial sand that was left there 10,000 years ago. And all that carbon has been released into the atmosphere.
It's a very good point. We often, when you talk to people about kind of climate change and the actions that we've got to take, it often focuses in on, you know, kind of changing our consumptive behaviours, you know, single-use plastics or switching from fossil fuels to electric cars or insulating your home properly. And actually, the losses in the environment that you kind of know, love, cultivate, walk around, enjoy, as Jack's talked about and you've talked about with the walks. You know, it's a big task there. Anyone wants to come in, please do. But if not, we've got a different type of question about tree planting and people wanting to engage in tree planting. So, Jack, I'll come to you first because you mentioned your schemes. But people have made the very reasonable point, which is if you aren't a council that's getting grants from the government to plant trees, or you're not a major landowner and want to plant trees, or even if you don't have a garden or you don't have a garden that's suitable to take a tree for long-term carbon sequestration, are there any options for you? Is that something that the Ribble Trust can help with?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Ribble Trust do, which differentiates us from some of our fellow charities, is we don't own any land. So all of our work is done on third-party land through incentives and persuasion, essentially. So we go out and identify the sites where we're going to get the most benefit to a wide range of things as described on private land, and we have discussions with farmers. And we try and find incentives for them, whether it's going to be better for your livestock, you're going to have better biosecurity, or they're going to have better shelter, or financial incentives, whether that's government grants or carbon offsetting. And we've got hundreds of these sites. In fact, we're fully booked this winter and next winter for tree planting. But we're trying to find more land because, I think we calculated that for Lancashire to achieve its part in the IPCC targets for woodland creation across the UK, Ribble Trust had to up its game 80 times, which is 240,000 trees. So we're over halfway there, but we've got to do a lot more. But we've got loads of opportunities coming, and we welcome any more. And so there's plenty of chance for people to get involved in planting trees.
Brilliant. Anyone else? Any other ideas for those that want to maybe plant a tree but know that you can't stick a big old oak in a window box? Diane, go for it.
Ask your local primary school what they're doing in their grounds. There's quite often large areas of nothing other than grass, and the gardeners who mow the grass don't mind as long as they can still get the mower around, which just takes a bit of measuring and discussion with them. And then the kids have got fruit trees to look at all year, which again is a win-win, isn't it? Children learning where food comes from.
It's a great point. It's an absolutely great point. Yeah. So the different options and different ways to kind of take it forward. Now, another question that's come in is from the hyper-local to the really quite big picture, and it might be for me, but I'll let the panel jump in first or challenge me if you want. This is not hagiography. In South Ribble, we've got massive potential for wave and tidal power in the Irish Sea. And what's the possibility for using this more in the future? Now, obviously, there's that kind of huge offshore thing, which I'll talk to, but have any of you guys seen anything that's more local about, say, maybe wind or solar or hydro? I've seen I've seen Archimedes screws here down in Devon. Who wants to come in first on what we can do locally? Jack's jumped in. Go on, Jack.
Well, largely because I'm involved with the Lancashire Leaders Working Group for Climate Change and Environment, and I know one of the discussions that we've been having is there is appetite and there's investment waiting to be poured into solar farms in Lancashire, and actually we need to improve our electricity network and reduce some of the charges for actually feeding green energy into the electricity network. In terms of some of the other renewables, not a big fan of run-of-the-river hydro schemes. We would rather see weirs removed, he says, with a fish pass going round the weir in the background. But the one that has concerned us many times has been about tidal barrages and how suitable and appropriate they are. We're very, very against those. We don't believe that they will pass that cost benefit, largely because their ability to continue to function because of the amount of sediment that comes down, even in a natural system. And the Ribble is a highly mobile sediment river. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert. Looking to Dave and Alan for some of the coastal stuff, because I know you guys have got your Living North Seas programme. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. And it's probably a bit like the slogan, right tree in the right place. It's the right renewable in the right place.
Alan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're looking at all different kinds of energy sources. Tidal energy, yeah, it's and barrages. Some of the schemes that have been planned recently have not really moved on for about 30 years. So we've got to look at some of these schemes and see how little how we get the ones that have the least effect, if they're going to happen, to have the least effect on biodiversity. So it is quite a tough question. I totally agree with Jack that we don't. We're not 100% sure about those type of things. We're not anti-development. We just want to make sure that whatever happens, there's net gain for wildlife at the end of it. So if we actually do get a scheme going, that wildlife gets more benefit than it's got at the moment. So we are pushing for net gain as much as possible.
Yeah,
I just mention we had a solar power plan down in Manchester, and it didn't come through in the end. But there were a lot of questions about solar power and how the actual farm would look. We actually there was a Natural England report on these places, and it found that brown hares nested underneath them. So there are certain benefits to some of these things as well.
It's a really good point. I mean, I'm going to put my cards on the table with this one. I've got a biology degree, and I did quite a lot of freshwater and marine ecophysiology. And I kind of share your concerns about major tidal barrages. I'm also an engineer's daughter, so apart from the kind of the species impact, you've also just got a practical question. If you're going to spend a lot of time, how often are you going to have to dredge the thing? When you look at the amount of sediment on this wall over there is a map of South Ribble constituency, and officially we actually go, especially off the West Lancs parts of the constituency, we're about 3 or 4 miles out, even though you could never get there because it is officially sands, and that's just a function of the amount of sediment that comes down. So what I am interested in tidal, though, is tidal kite development, because you can't deny that we don't have the tidal change. So I've seen very early days, but that company over in Anglesey that's got basically a tethered kite on the floor of the Menai Straits to try and harness that kind of power of nature. I think there are interesting things there, but. John, I definitely will come to you, but just to highlight, one of the things we were talking in the Conservative Environment Network panel conference that we've just had, the chat was saying, we've got an electricity grid that was designed for about 1,000 inputs. At the moment, it's now got 5 million. and all of these little local generation schemes that we're talking about, which are absolutely spot on. So we've actually got a question of infrastructure to make sure that we're not building something that has both a deleterious impact on nature, but also actually has a deleterious impact on the grid that we rely on to get our electricity, whatever its source. So I think you do end up in quite interesting questions, even when they're very local at scale. John, forgive me, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to come at it from a slightly different angle. It's important, if people want to make personal choices, to switch from using fossil fuel generated energy to renewable energy. And you can do that by switching your provider, which is very current at the moment because quite a few of them have gone bankrupt. And so the market, it's highlighted the importance of our personal consumption. While you can switch to the green energy, is it more important to actually consume less energy? Because it doesn't matter where the energy is coming from in one hand, if you could actually reduce the amount you consume, it's cheaper for you and it's having a less impact all round. And there's lots of ways people can reduce, insulating your house is one, and people do need support in that. Having putting the thermometer down lower on the thermostat, maybe wearing an extra layer of clothes, doing a bit more exercise, which is good for your health and well-being as well. There are lots of other ways that people can reduce their consumption. I've got solar panels on my roof, and I'm in the maybe enviable position of my electricity company pays me more than I pay them.
A very cute man that got in on that one early, aren't you, John? Yeah, exactly. And I think what this conversation starts to highlight at a very local level is how there is no silver bullet to any of this. There's going to be a range of things, everybody has an option to make a difference. But no one thing is going to sort it. Tidal's not going to sort it. Nuclear's not. Insulating houses alone isn't, etc., etc., etc. And how it needs to be a debate that everybody's having. Now, Karen, you will be pleased to know that your blister pack question has sparked something of a debate, and has unearthed a chemist in Lostock Hall that's collecting them as well. So we'll pass those details on to you. But the basic idea of trying to think about packaging that is recyclable as well as functional, it's really important. And you've highlighted with the scale of the people that were interested, how many people really want to kind of make that difference. So I think we've got 2 minutes to go, and rather than the flipping politician having the last word, can I give the last word to each one of the members of our panel? Maybe, if you want to sum up in 10 or 20 seconds, we've got 4 weeks to go to COP, what you'd say to the people of South Ribble, either watching now or watching this back on catch up. I will do it in the order on my screen. So Alan first and then David.
Right, just going back to Karen's thing, you look at the litter in the streams, you look at the litter on the streets, people worry about what David Attenborough said on TV that's happening in the oceans. This litter that we're throwing away in the streets and into our streams is getting into those oceans. So, we've got to start doing things at home as well before we start putting pressure on the councils and government as well. And if we can get 1 in 4 people in the UK to actually get involved with nature and get involved with restoration, then it'll make a huge difference.
Thank you, David.
Just to back up that nature is an important part of carbon capture and storage. As I mentioned before, with the salt marsh and the peat in the soils of South Ribble constituency.
Good point. That's a very good point. Diane, what would you say is your final message?
Plant something for the bees earlier in the year, sow some bulbs, and plant a fruit tree if you can find one.
That's phenomenal. Correct answer. John, what's your message to South Ribble?
I'll go back to an old strapline of Friends of the Earth, which is think global, act local. And with COP26, we need the world leaders to act, we need the national governments to act, we need the local governments to act, we need the MPs to act, and as individuals, we all need to act. There is only one planet, and I'm a friend of the Earth. Don't be an enemy of the Earth.
Very beautifully put, sir. Jack, what would you say?
Please take whatever action you can at home, however small. It all contributes, and together we can make a difference. And if you can get out and help to improve the environment, it makes a heck of a difference.
Thank you. And Karen, final 5 seconds, your message to South Ribble and me as I take this conversation up to Glasgow in a few weeks' time.
Just think ditto to what everybody's just said, but let's recycle as much as we can and save the planet.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to a knowledgeable and engaging panel. I've really enjoyed it. I hope people have watching, and I hope to see you out and about. And if anyone wants to get in touch with us or raise anything or amplify any of the stuff they're doing, use and abuse me as the South Ribble MP. But apart from that, I hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much. See you later. Bye.